Well, here we are. I've decided to do a little short video. Hopefully it is short. I've been receiving some questions from people who have been looking at the videos that we put online. And so not a lot of questions here, but sometimes it's easier to answer them in a way that is not through email, because it's easier for me to talk than it is to type something out. Plus, I think that these are questions that other people also have, and so it's good to do a full make it available to everybody, basically. So one of the first questions that came in, probably just a little clarification. It says, did I hear you mention in the class that election does not guarantee salvation? If so, that seems different than what you have taught in the election class, because we did a 14-week doctrine of election class prior to this. If election does not guarantee salvation, then it sounds like that person was never elected to begin with. Would King Saul be considered a person that was elected but lost his salvation, or was he someone that God already knew was not going to be elected, since God is omniscient when his end came? Well, if I said that, I apologize, because I misspoke. Election does guarantee salvation. I think, now let me step back. When I talk about election, I'm talking about two aspects. One is the entire process that God predestined, called, justified, ended up glorified. That's Romans 8. What is that? Romans 8:26, 8:27, Romans 8:30, Romans 8:30. So, however, though, I think what I said was that, I'll take my own life. I got saved at 18 and a half, and from God's perspective, I was elect before the foundation of the world. He chose me, Ephesians 1:4. He predestined me, Ephesians 1:5. However, if we look at that context, I'll read it because I think it's helpful just to answer this question briefly. Is in the book of Romans, when he makes this, he makes this phrase. So I'll read it to be thorough and not as fast. Okay. So it is Romans 8:29 and 30. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. Verse 30, this is the important one. And those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. So, I got it's not really unseen realm, but think about it this way. You got predestined here, then what do you have? You have those whom he predestined, he called, those whom he called, he justified, and those whom he justified, he glorified. All right. Now what we saw in the class, which I won't go and do here, you guys can watch that, is there's some other things that are missing in this chain. This is called the golden chain of election in theology. But predestined is in eternity past, okay? Or before the foundation of the world, which is still eternity past, okay? These are all in time. So what I'm saying is that election guarantees glorification, which is salvation. But God called me when I was 18 and a half. Okay, and at that same moment, I was justified at 18 and a half. Glorification, I'm 46. Hopefully it'll happen when I'm 46. Jesus comes back, but I doubt it. It'll happen that fast. So who knows when that's going to be. Okay, but what was the state of my salvation between the time I was born and the time I was 18 and a half? According to God's perspective, okay, this is the elect process. So the elect is all these, just not at different, they're at different stages. So when I was 17, was I saved? Was I called yet? Called is the equivalent, justified, I'll put these together, is the equivalent of receiving salvation, these two right here. Because when God calls you, we saw that it was an internal call. At that moment that I responded in faith, I chose to respond in faith by God's grace. I became justified or declared righteous. But when I was 17, hypothetically, if I died, would I have gone to heaven? The answer is no. Even though I was elect, again, this is hypothetical. It kind of contradicts itself. Because I'm elect, I would have never died at 17, because otherwise, if I was elect, God would have saved me prior to that. However, hypothetically, at 17, this is not hypothetical. At 17 years old, I was elect, but I was not saved yet. Salvation, the calling and the justification, took place when I was 18. But from God's perspective, it's all planned and done. So that's an important distinction. So when we talk about election doesn't guarantee salvation, if I said that, I misspoke. Election does guarantee salvation, but election doesn't guarantee that at 17 I was saved or I was born saved. That's maybe a better way. The elect people aren't born saved. They still, in time, when the proper time comes, it might be 45 for some, it could be on the deathbed of some, that their whole life, God, from God's perspective, they might be elect, but they're not saved yet. If you're elect, you will be saved 100%. But that doesn't mean your entire existence, you're living in a state of salvation. You're living in a state of this election, but not salvation. So election is that process, a cumulative, comprehensive process that isn't limited by these individual things necessarily. It's the whole thing. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So would King Saul be considered a person that was elected but lost his salvation? It's hard to know about King Saul and his salvation. Election is not as, it's in the Old Testament for sure, but it's not as detailed out. Additionally, salvation in the Old Testament, certainly you had a corporate salvation in the sense of not individual, but Israel was God's elect corporate nation above any others. And that is, we have been seeing that in the unseen realm, especially session 17, where we talked about God taking Israel to himself and they were special and they had special privileges amongst no other nation in the world. Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 32, there's other passages. But all we know about Saul is Saul was called to be king. The Holy Spirit, we know, came upon people in the Old Testament, not necessarily make. What I'm saying is it possible for the Holy Spirit to come upon somebody who was unsaved? Yes. Balaam was a good example. He spoke prophetically. And was he saved? I really doubt it. But could he speak? I mean, the donkey could speak, right? The donkey wasn't saved either. So in this sense, the Holy Spirit came upon Saul to do very bold and adventurous exploits as the king of Israel, and in order to stand as the leader. Was he saved? Don't know. I mean, the only hint that we would have is that when he goes to the witch at Endor in 2 Samuel or 1 Samuel 28, he brings up Samuel. When Saul goes to the witch at Endor, she brings up Samuel because Saul was so desperate because God had abandoned him, taken his spirit away. Well, Samuel says, "You're going to be with me tomorrow, you and your sons." So, of course, Samuel's saved. So does that mean that Saul was down there as well? That would be the only hint that I would know of. Okay, so that's question number one. Question number two. Not only does the author know exactly where in the divine council hierarchy we will be when we die, but the fact that we will be the sons of God, below Cherubim, Seraphim, Michael, Gabriel, but above and having rulership over angels, servants, and attendants is mind-blowing. Where does Heiser get his research information from which it is so detailed? Does he have a reference to Enoch or other Jewish scriptures in his book? And is the translation accurate or just speculative? There's several questions there. What we've been doing is we've gotten a little bit beyond Heiser. So what I mean by that is Heiser has his book, The Unseen Realm. He also has a book called Angels. He also has a book that just came out in April called Demons. So what I've tried to do as a teacher is to take all of the things, also to do my own research, and then what we did in class was try to put them up in our hierarchy. So Heiser, I tend to see things just a hair different than him. He could be right, he's the scholar, but he sees, if I was to do it this way, to answer the question, which is helpful. Let's see. And we did this going back when we, probably sessions, I don't know, 4 through 12. We were talking about the hierarchy of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So if we go like this, of course Yahweh, the Creator, he's in his own class by himself. Here would be kind of the special group, the Divine Council, okay? And then if we come down like this, and this is going to be humans, okay? This is the spiritual boundary, okay? These, in this box here, including Yahweh, these, what we've been saying, these are all the Elohim, okay? We are not Elohim, we are humans. Elohim, as we said before, simply is synonymous with spiritual being. So of course God, Yahweh, is a spiritual being. Angels are spiritual beings. Humans are not. I mean, we have a spiritual component, but we have that additional physical component of being incarnated, made flesh, just like Jesus. So Jesus was here, he came down and it took on this additional permanent, this is important, permanent physical condition. Physical nature. I don't know if you can see that because of the thing. So, humans, we're going to say permanent physical. That's important. That's what separates us from the angels. Now, what we said are the Elohim. As we know, in Genesis 18 as an example, angels came down in physical form. Yahweh came down in physical form. They had lunch with Abraham. And then that's right before the Sodom and Gomorrah incident. Can these spiritual beings take on physical form? Yes. And they grabbed his hand. You know, they grabbed Lot's hand in Genesis 19. They ate food. So they can venture into our physical realm, but it's not permanent. That's the distinction. Elohim are spiritual beings that do not have a permanent physical, corporeal existence or body. Can they do it? Yes, and we see many examples. Okay, so when Jesus comes down, he takes it on permanently. That's what makes him distinct. Okay, going back though, this is where we're going to, at least for me, I'm going to disagree with Heiser a hair. Heiser, what we said, I'll go put it up here. We have, the cherub, we have the seraph. Heiser, rightly so, these are guardians. Okay, then we have Michael. We're not going to do all of them. Michael, Gabriel, the sons of God, Genesis or Job 38, Job 2, Job 1, sons of God. We also have, I think, they're also called the Watchers, Daniel 4. You have the other princes. That would be Daniel 10. These princes, I think, are synonymous with these guys, but remember, we're dealing with Old Testament and New Testament language. Michael is a prince. He's actually one of the chief princes. So now over here, you have chief princes, which seems to be synonymous in the New Testament with archangels. Okay. We saw from Daniel 7 and 8 that down here you have these attendants, which is what the question asked. You have these attendants or lower class angels if you want. So, what Heiser says is that anybody who is an Elohim, including these attendants, are part of the divine council. I tend to see it differently. I see that the divine council is just these certain beings who are invited in and to help administer in the world. We've seen that. Let us. You know, in Isaiah 6 and Genesis 1 and even Genesis 3, they become like one of us. So that would be a distinction. So the question is, where does Heiser get his material? Well, there is, and I mentioned this before, that in ancient Near Eastern literature, there are 4 levels. So here you have 3. Okay, you have Yahweh being number 1. You have this group being number 2. And then in the Near Eastern literature, which is a lot of where Heiser's getting his material, you have usually number 2 is like, for example, El in Ugaritic, in Canaanite information, Canaanite literature. El is the main guy, and then he has sons. For them, Baal would be there, and he's got. El has. If we're going to do purple is the Canaanite literature. He has 70 sons. El does, and they were in the divine council. But then there was these other number 3 over here. Were these artisan gods? You know, they're artisan gods. Little g. They were part of, you know, what an artisan does. Okay. So then you have number 4 is this group. Basically the servant gods. They were still gods, but they were down here as servants. So that is a lot of where the connection takes place. Because, you know, where does Heiser get his research information from, which is so detailed? It's from the Canaanite literature as one example. Now in the Bible, what I see is 1, certainly Yahweh, 2, these guys, the servants, but we don't see the artisan, that level, that 3rd level. So, but Heiser, and I don't want to misquote him, I mean, he says that even though he recognizes the Canaanite literature material in the purple, he still thinks that all of the angels are in the divine council and they're part of his God's divine council of having them help. Could be right. I see a little bit of a distinction there. Let's see. Does he have a reference to Enoch or other Jewish scriptures? He does. There's no doubt that you can't study angels without looking into the book of Enoch. And we've discussed that a little bit more, that Enoch is a collection of 5 different books. I don't believe that it was written by Enoch, the 7th from Adam. It's the earliest copies of the book of Enoch, I think, are from right around 200 BC, maybe even a little bit earlier in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's not a full book either, it's just little snippets. But, and there's also the book of Giants, there's the book of Noah, there's a whole bunch of other things in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is the translation accurate or just speculative? Well, the problem that we have with Enoch is, the book of Enoch's been known certainly by the church fathers, and then it disappeared. And it was never around again until really the 18th century. There was a full copy of the book of Enoch in what is known as Ethiopic language. And so after they found this full copy of Ethiopic, they could tell that it was translated from Greek, and then most likely from the Greek from the Hebrew. But it has 108 chapters in it. It's, again, a collection of all these 5 different books. The first book of Enoch, which I think goes up to like chapter 30 or something like that, seems to be a little bit different than the rest of the other books. So what we've been learning about the nature of Genesis 6 appears in 1 Enoch 6, the nature of demons in 1 Enoch 15, the nature of the Watchers coming down, really chapters 6 all the way through 15. That's in the first book of Enoch. Now, I got to be careful that what we know as First Enoch contains 5 collections of books. But there's also another Second Enoch and Third Enoch, which we're not getting into. Those seem to have come later and they weren't part of the first one. So, is it accurate? All we know is that in Jude 14, he quotes the book of Enoch. He quotes, I believe it's chapter 1, verse 10, where he says, even Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied that the Lord would come with 10,000s of the saints to bring judgment on the ungodly. He quotes that in the book of Jude. He quotes this Enoch reference. And so the fact that he quotes Enoch, does that mean that all we know is that Jude was making a point by quoting that one verse? Does that mean the whole rest of the book is legitimate and inspired? I don't think so. So the way that we are approaching the book of Enoch and even bringing it into the conversation is not to endorse it as being inspired and equal with Scripture. Even though if you go to the Ethiopic church today, in their Bible, the book of Enoch is in there. They consider it inspired, and it's not surprising because their tradition, the only book that we had up until recently, the Dead Sea Scrolls, was Enoch in Ethiopic. So they had kind of their own desire to do that. What we've been saying is that what we're trying to do, the reason why the book of Enoch and other books, Jubilees, as in one example, are important is because it gets us into the mindset of what Jude and Peter and Paul, Jesus, all of the first century believers were reading. They were familiar with all this literature, and many times they used that literature to make points in the inspired Scripture, which is what Jude does. So he takes something out of the book of Jude and says, wow, this is, and he uses it to provide a spiritual lesson. So let me give you a modern illustration. If I am providing an illustration or sermon and I say, those of you who are Lord of the Ring fans, there's a point in the Lord of the Rings where Gandalf is talking to Frodo and he says, Frodo, we don't ask for bad things that happen to us, but we need to do the best we can with what has been given to us. And so I quote the Lord of the Rings in my sermon. And let's say 500 years from now, if I was an inspired guy, which I'm not, they read my sermon and they're like, hey, he's quoting the Lord of the Rings. Would that mean that the whole Lord of the Rings genre and story and narrative is true? No, it's complete fiction. But I used that example from the Lord of the Rings. Why? Because you all have watched the Lord of the Rings, I'm assuming. And so the Lord of the Rings is very prominent in our culture. So if I use that as an illustration, I'm using that story, fictional story, as an example to prove or to illustrate the biblical principle, which is true. Now, is that what Jude was doing? Is that what Peter was doing? Were they using the book of Enoch, which, let's say, was fictional, but they're using it in order to prove a point that is true? We don't know. Again, what we do know is that both 2 Peter and Jude talk about these angels that sinned in the context of them being false teachers. That's clearer in the book of Enoch, which I shared. It's also clear in the book of Jude and 2 Peter that they were giving illustrations of how false teachers are going to be judged. So if there's false teachers in the church today, their judgment is sure. Why? Because God judged the false teachers of the angels, and so God's consistent. Okay. So sometimes there's just not enough information. Question number 3. Why are the unfaithful, unrighteous doxas so revered? Aren't they evil? Why will the righteous angels not slander them? Is it because it's not worth their effort, or are they afraid of them, or God told everyone to leave them and let them deal with them? Okay, this is a reference to the book of Jude. Doxas is a word that means glory. In Greek, doxa means glory, just like the glory of God. Okay. But let's see here about these. There it is. He's talking about these angels. This is Jude 8. There's only one chapter in Jude 1:8. Yet in like manner, these people, these false teachers, also relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, they reject authority, and they blaspheme the glorious ones. That's the doxas. they blaspheme them. And then Jude goes in and he brings up this story, again, from another pseudepigraphal book or apocryphal book. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment against, in this question, in this comment, the devil, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." But these people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and he goes on. So the question here is, why are the unfaithful, unrighteous doxas so revered? Well, it's interesting. I'll give you an example. In the book of Exodus, I believe it's 21 or 22. It says, "Do not curse God, nor a ruler of your people." Don't pronounce a curse on them or a blasphemy or an insult. Well, if you remember in the book of Acts, Paul was being questioned by the leaders. And as he's being questioned, the high priest, people think that Paul didn't have good vision. So the high priest, whom he couldn't really see potentially, motions to one of his bodyguards to hit Paul. And so they punch Paul or slap him or whatever. And so Paul says, "You whitewashed, blah, blah, blah." He puts an insult. And someone says, "Do you dare put an insult against your chief priest, your ruler?" And Paul says, "Whoa, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that he was the chief ruler." So Paul even backs off there because Scripture is what it is. And Scripture is let me step back. The ruler was obviously wicked. He was anti-Jesus. He was anti-Paul. He certainly struck Paul for no reason. But Paul said, because of your position, you could be as wicked as can be, but because of your position, I'm still not going to curse you, because Scripture tells me not to. So I wouldn't say that the question here is, why are the unfaithful, the unrighteous, glorious ones so revered? I guess it depends on how we define the word revered. Revered would be to maybe, in my mind, to look up to respect. I don't think that Jude is encouraging us to look up to or to look up to the devil, as an example, or these, I'll say it this way. Some of these sons of God fell, so they have become fallen. All right? So they're evil. The devil, was the devil in this group at the beginning? Was he part of the divine council? We don't know. All we know is that according to Ezekiel 28, he was an anointed cherub. So, what Jude is saying is that even Michael, and he's one of the chief princes. He's an archangel. Even he did not insult the devil. Now, I'm not saying he's looking up the devil, that he reveres him, if we talk about in a positive sense. He just basically says, you know what, I know what position you have. I know that you haven't been removed from that position, that you are a direct creation of Yahweh himself, and when you were created, according to Ezekiel 28, you were perfect in beauty, full of wisdom. He was an anointed cherub, not just a cherub, but an anointed one. Now, I think he's been cast down a little bit, but he still has the status of being this tremendous, glorious creation, even though he's chosen evil. Michael, because of his position, refuses to insult him. So that's what even Paul, even though that chief priest was a evil guy, or turned evil, or at least stubborn, obstinate, still Paul said, I'm not going to speak evil of him based on his position. So is it because it's not worth their effort, or they're afraid of him? I don't think Michael's afraid of them at all. I don't think Michael's afraid of the devil by any means. Michael he's righteous. So he's not going to disrespect Yahweh's creation, because that would be disrespecting Yahweh, because Yahweh put him in that position of authority, a government. It's similar to the principle in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2:13 and on, where we have the government, and they're in a position, it says all governments are ordained by God and they're God's servants, even though they might be wicked. So why does Paul encourage us to, follow the government, generally speaking, to be good citizens? Because God has ordained that position. They could be as evil as can be. And granted, we don't have to follow every last thing that they say, but we do have to respect their position. So there's that similarity. What we do know later is Michael and the devil square off in Revelation chapter 12. It says Michael and his angels, which I think are some of these angels, and the devil and his kingdom, they fight and Michael wins. So I don't think Michael is scared of him at all. But I think that what Michael appeals to in the Jude passage, he appeals to the Lord rebuke you. This also comes out of Zechariah chapter 3, where the devil squares off again and God rebukes him. Okay, question number 4 here. Why are the Nephilim, sessions 14 and 15, called the mighty heroes of old, the famous men or ones of reputation? In other words, why are they glorified when they are evil? Is it because they are big and can win wars for the humankind, like Goliath? That I would say yes. That the word there, they are men of name. That's what it literally says. They are ones of name. They have a reputation. Well, we don't want to say glorified, because what I'm assuming here is, why are they glorified when they are evil? What we're doing here is we are putting glorified as a positive and evil as a bad. I don't think that the Bible, we talk about that. We don't want to glorify evil. We don't want to glorify suicide. We don't want to make it look positive. I think that's the way that this person is using the word. I don't think that Moses was writing to glorify them. I think Moses was just writing to say, you've heard of these people. So for these people that have a reputation, a good way to say it would be, if we were to do it up here, we use this in English. We have famous and infamous, okay? That's really what he's saying, is these guys are the infamous ones of old. They're famous, but they're famous for a negative reason. And like Hitler is well known. He is a person of reputation. He's a person that has a very well-known history. But some people would call him a hero. We would call him, he's infamous. He's famous for the wrong reasons. And so that's what he's saying here, is that he's writing to the Israelites, thousands of years later, and saying, remember those guys? You've heard about them. They were men of name. They were the heroes of old. Why? Because they did, we don't know it's in Genesis 6. There's no reference to what they did. It just labels them. But what we do know is, if Goliath, as it was mentioned here, in 1 Samuel 17 as an example, if Goliath is any indicator of what they were capable of, especially an army of them, they definitely would have had major exploits. It just happened to be that God took him out through David. But imagine it probably took a lot to take these guys down. So we do have that interesting perspective. So I wouldn't say that they're glorified, but it is because that they're big and they can win wars and other things. And so we do know that in Numbers 13, 32, and 33 as an example, that they were, when they were getting ready to go into the conquest of the land, the 12 spies were sent out. Oh wow, we saw the Nephilim, they're there, the sons of Enoch, or the Anakim, who were descendants of the Nephilim. Wow, they are large, and we can't do it. So there's no doubt there's fear there. Okay. So question number 5. We have 6 questions. Are all the sons of God, and also watchers, that came down to earth to mate with daughters of humankind evil, since they defied God to deliberately pollute the gene pool? Hence, that's why God had all the giants killed off in the Bible. I would say yes, because, and what we saw in session 17 was that God, okay, we'll talk about it in a minute, but you have this phrase, the sons of God. So the sons of God and the watchers, okay, the sons of God appear first in Genesis 6, 6:2 and 6:4. Okay? So they rebelled, came down to cross this boundary. That's Jude 6. Cross this boundary to mate with women, which was forbidden, and we talked about that in the sessions. Okay. But what we know, or what we deduce, is that some of them came down. According to the book of Enoch, chapter 6, it was 200. Okay. So what we know is later in Deuteronomy 32, God takes some of these sons of God, and which have not fallen. Okay. So you have a big group here. I don't know how big, but let's just say 300. Okay. 200 of them come down if Enoch is right, which don't know it is. They mate. So now they're fallen and they're kicked out of the group. They're still sons of God in their position, remember. But they have become fallen and evil. Well, there's still some righteous ones left. Okay? And because we know that in Daniel 4, the watchers there are giving a decree against Nebuchadnezzar, and the watchers were still righteous there. So there's still some good righteous watchers or sons of God. Well, in Deuteronomy 32, God divides the nations up according to the sons of God, and he gives over the nations, which is 70 or 72, we talked about that in session 17, over to some of these sons of God, or these watchers. It's interesting, the word watcher, that's what they do. They watch, they oversee. That's an Aramaic term. But they begin to oversee the administration of God's decrees, his counsel, in the nations, to all of the 70 nations. What we realize, and we don't know this 100% sure, that do all of the sons of God that were given over to the 70 nations, they were righteous at the beginning. That's a good deduction. But then later, some of them fall and become evil and defect. So we need to get out of our mind this idea, going back over here. Okay, I'll just do this. Okay. This is God. This is Genesis 1 and 2. So, timeline. So what we need to do is we need to get out of our mind that Satan, he rebelled at least before chapter 3. That's all we know, because he shows up and he contradicts God. Did he fall in Genesis 1 and 2 in that time frame during the 6-day creation week? We don't know. All we know is that angels were here. They were rejoicing that the world was created, the sons of God, and the morning stars, Job 38, 6 and 7. Okay? We need to get out of our mind that Satan, when he rebelled, he took a third of the angels with him, and he took them all at once. That you can't not prove that. In fact, when we did do our Revelation 12 study, I think that was back, 14, 15, 16, not 16, but maybe 13, 14, 15 session in there. We went through Revelation 12 line by line to show that this idea of Satan rebelling here before the world was, with a third, swiped them all at once, is not consistent. What we need to recognize is that there was a defection with Satan. There was a defection in chapter 6. There was a defection in subsequent to Deuteronomy 32. There also was another defection in here. We have Genesis 6. There was a defection, I would say, Genesis 14. Why? Because there's Rephaim in the land again. Rephaim is synonymous with Nephilim. There's all these tribes. There's the Emim, anyways, there's a whole bunch of Zamzumim. You look at Deuteronomy 2, you'll see these. So these Rephaim, these Zamzumim, these Emim, these Nephilim, they're all of this giant hybrid offspring culture. Okay, a whole bunch of them. Well, what we see is Genesis 6, they're all drowned. By Genesis 14, there were Rephaim in the land. And then by basically Numbers 13, which is here, the whole land, Numbers 13, doesn't look like it, the whole land was filled with giants, Nephilim, Anakim. So there was more defections here. And one of the things that I mentioned is if you look at Genesis 6:4, I sent an article out to everybody looking at the way that the Hebrew is, I block diagrammed it, looking at phrases. It's pretty nerdy, but Moses writes very clear to this group of Israelites living much later. Hey guys, by the way, there were Nephilim in the land in those days and also afterward. How did they get there? Well, they got there when the sons of God came down mating with human women and producing children. So it's a subordinate clause saying that this happened prior to the flood and also afterward in the same manner. So there was a fall here, a defection here, and then there had to be a defection after Deuteronomy 32. I'll do it this way. Because when God had spread and assigned the nations to certain sons of God, later they sought worship for themselves, and then it's a war. It's a war. The Bible is a book of a war between Yahweh and his rebellious creatures, including us. I mean, let's be honest. He comes to save us, but he still is going to make war against wicked people. I think about Herod as an example. Not Herod the Great, but Herod Agrippa, Herod in Acts chapter 12. God sends an angel to kill him because he was taking glory for himself. So God has enemies in both camps, and God is going to overcome them. In Isaiah 24:21 is a great example too, where it says that in the last days that God is going to punish the wicked here, and he's going to punish the powers of heaven, which is pretty amazing. So, all that being said, that's why God had to God had all the giants killed off in the Bible. So we saw that the fact that there was Rephaim in the land, and then in Deuteronomy when they conquered, one of the things that they were to do was to exterminate everything. That's why in the book of Joshua, I believe it's chapter 11, 21 and 22 in there, where it says that the summary is, hey, we killed all the Nephilim except some of them ran off and hid into the Philistine cities by the coast, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, Ekron. So those cities, it says, hey, we did a good job. We cleaned the land. And I think that is part of what God was doing. He was cleaning the land of the offspring of these fallen angels because God was going to get victory over them. Let's see here. Were some of the giants killed off, missed, or deliberately not killed? I think they ran off in fear. Amazingly. They ran off, and I think God allowed them to be there, at least like in the cities, because later God used them. You know, for example, Goliath was one of the descendants of the giant. He had 4 brothers. He was from Gath, which is one of the cities that Joshua mentions. And God, again, gets victory. So what we do know is in the book of Samuel that David and his mighty men David killed Goliath, but Goliath had some brothers, 4 brothers. And they killed off, especially down in Hebron, they killed off the rest of them. So after the book of Samuel, we never hear of giants again. Ever. So you're talking, if we were to do, David was roughly 1000 BC. So there was there's no more indication in the Bible after that. Let's see here. Are they unusually tall? Are unusually tall people assumed to have giant recessive genes and are deemed to be descendants of Nephilim or other sons of God giants? That's a great question. That's a great question. It's hard to know because we don't necessarily have the genetic profile of a Nephilim. That's one of the things that I've been trying to do with L.A. Marzulli is to find that. We've been looking at potentially mounds, legally, to digging mounds because, again, if you go back in the late 1800s, all the mounds in the eastern United States, huge, huge mounds, which are, again, heroes of old, these exploits, these megalithic structures. Those are mega earth, but you have other megalithic, mega stone structures all around the world. that are thought, possibly, not for sure, to have been built by these heroes of old, these Nephilim hybrids, who had access to very sophisticated geometry, trigonometry even, astronomical stuff. So the idea or the theory, and I think there's a little bit of archaeological, at least literary evidence from it, in that when they fled, let's just think of a map here, Israel here, when they fled west to the coast, that there is records of them fleeing all the way over to the Straits of Gibraltar, which is the western end of the Mediterranean Sea. And could that indicate that possibly, maybe, I don't know, no facts, that they sailed across over to the American continent, to North America, which is interesting because what you do see, and I have proof of it, I do have proof of it in the sense of the Smithsonian records, that there were giants, that these mounds that you find all in the eastern United States were these large structures geared, again, scientifically, mathematically, astronomically, very much aligned. So there was some very sophisticated information. But you have giants buried in them. It's well known. I mean, Smithsonian denies it, but again, I have all of their field reports which describe things like this. So, did they flee over here? And what you do have is oral records, which are hard to be definitive on, that a lot of the Native American traditions, oral traditions, has them, the Native American tribes, fighting against these cannibalistic, white-skinned, not total white-skinned, but red-haired giants. So that's in a lot of their traditions. They'll talk about that, hey, the giants, these giants are the ones that built the mounds. It wasn't us, and we had to fight them. It's interesting, too, as I mentioned way back a few sessions ago, that you can go online and put in Google search Abraham Lincoln quote of giants. And Abraham Lincoln, in one of his addresses, he recognized, he was very familiar in the 1860s. That's when they started digging into these mounds, finding all these giants. And he makes a comment that there's this ancient race of giants which are buried in the mounds that we see all around our country. So that was the science at the time. Those were the archaeologists for the Smithsonian coming out. It wasn't until later that they started hiding that information for, well, who knows what reason. So, okay. But genetics, what we're trying to do, honestly, as crazy as it sounds, is we're trying to find a mound that has been unexcavated, that is on legal property. You can dig into these mounds, as long as you have, each state is different. And we're trying to see what's in there, because a lot of them, most of them, I would say, are burial mounds. And if you do a study of them, you can see some of the older ones that you have, certainly Native Americans, some Native Americans came later and buried on the top. But if you go down to certain parts, you can see that there was a previous culture that had buried in the lower parts naturally. And they came, some of the Native American built or buried their people in there at a higher level. Our goal is to try to find the lower level so that we can find a body, a skeleton, which we would leave in place. But we want to video it, we want to record it, and we want to take DNA samples because we've done a pretty good job so far of finding, of studying and defining ancient DNA. So that's where our goal is, because then what we would be able to hopefully find is at least a DNA genetic profile. Now what we have found in our studies in Peru was that when we were doing some genetic profiling down there of ancient DNA, that the nuclear DNA, or the paternal side, the father's side, there's less of it to start with, and it decays really fast. All DNA decays. But there's so much of the maternal, the mitochondrial DNA, that oftentimes we can find not always, some of it's so degraded that it doesn't matter, but we'll be able to determine the haplogroup or the family group from where that particular person was from. And so that was some of the research that we've been doing at some of the elongated people that were living in Paracas. And what we found there and this is science. I mean, this isn't make-believe. We even had it double-blind tested, which is the standard way to do things. Is when we looked at our when we got the DNA profiles from these particular elongated skulls, not all of them. The typical thing is that the Native Americans, like in Peru, the natives there, that they migrated over the Bering Strait from basically China, however many millennia ago. That's haplogroup B. Okay, we did find some of the groups that had haplogroup B in them. However, we did, well, I don't get off on this, but answering the question. We had 58 samples from 18 different skulls that we did. And so what we found was, I don't know, it was probably at least 2/3 of the skulls, because sometimes we took many samples from one skull. That's why it came up to 58, because we would take hair, we'd take a tooth, we'd take bone, or we would grind in and take inside of the bone some powder. So we did a variety of things, all with legal permission. So what we found was most of the skulls came from like Europe or the Middle East or Central Asia, like the Black Sea, even some that had certain haplogroups from the land of Israel, the Druze. So it's interesting that you had these people there. These people we did some carbon-14 dating on a couple of them, and they were either from like 500 AD or a little earlier. So still a couple thousand years, way before Columbus, that their DNA profile showed them not coming from the Bering Strait, which is the typical Native American, all the way down through Latin America, South America, but that they came from the east, they came from across the ocean. So with that thing that I was mentioning before, when Joshua and them forced the Nephilim tribes out and weren't able to kill them all, or just let them go, we don't know why. They fled over the Straits of Gibraltar. Did they flee over here? Don't know. We're trying to figure it out. Okay, the final question here. The evil sons of God that mated with humankind, women, to corrupt the gene pool. Logically, they had to have come from the right-hand side of your chart, which is this. Originally, I had put a chart over here where I put the devil's kingdom on this side. Okay. So when did these demonic angels defect to join Satan? Had to be before they came to earth with their evil intentions, and definitely before Revelation 12:4. Could they possibly have defected even before the earth was created? Okay, that's a good question, and it's important to make this distinction again. So I think what's being misunderstood here is, when did these demonic angels defect to join Satan? So remember, this is important. The sons of God, I don't believe, are demons. Demons, if we go over here, move this out of the way. Remember, Genesis 6, you have the Rephaim, these hybrids. Okay. Well, when they die, their spirit continues on. So demons, according to 1 Enoch, chapter 15, demons are the spirits of the dead Nephilim. So a Nephilim is born, it's crossed this boundary, its dad is from this one, and its mom is from the physical realm. So that's what the book of Enoch is about, is that, hey, they can't go either way because they're from both realms, and the only way to be saved is if you're from the physical realm. That Jesus died for physical human beings. He didn't die for angels. That's Hebrews chapter 2. Okay? But when the Nephilim was drowned in the flood or killed, like Goliath. So let's go up here to Goliath. Okay? So 1 Samuel 17. Goliath has his head cut off. He's killed. David cuts off his head. Well, what happens to his spirit, his immaterial? According to the book of the Enoch, his spirit continues on, and so he has a demonic. That's the demonic spirits. These are the unclean spirits. It's interesting to me that the demons that you find in the Gospels always seek to be what? They always seek to possess or to be re-embodied. You don't have the angels seeking to be re-embodied. They can get a body anytime they want. But these demons, which are the Nephilim, who once had bodies, they no longer have them, and they want them. And that's one of the things that the book of Enoch talks about, is how they can't taste anymore, and they used to be able to taste, and they want that again. Okay? So, when did these demonic angels defect? Well, they didn't exist over here. They existed after Genesis 6, or if they were killed prior in a fight or whatever. Certainly in the flood they died. Okay, you can't see it, but anyways, just follow my thinking. So that they defected. They were already evil because their fathers were evil and wicked, these fallen evil angels. Therefore, by default, they're part of that team. Could they desire to be, could they have a desire to be saved and to follow after God, these demons? No, because they're wicked. And the only way that you become righteous after being wicked is if God regenerates you. Even humanity, right? Humans have a fallen nature. So they can't just will out of their own wills, apart from God, to, I want to be righteous now. God has to work in their heart. That's why we're saved by grace. So, let's see. Could they possibly have defected even before the earth was created? Could the demons possibly have defected even before the earth was created? I would say no. The reason why is because they didn't exist yet. The demons, remember, the demons are the Nephilim. The Nephilim did not exist until the Genesis 6 episode, happening here. So the only ones that existed prior were all of these angels. So I would even put, if we were to go in a hierarchy of the fallen realm, which we'll do in purple. Let's just do this over here with Satan. I would put demons, they're spiritual, but demons are the bottom. And then you have the sons of God, the defected ones here. You have the watchers who defected. Are there other angels who defected? Well, we do know there are, because in Genesis or in Revelation 12 it says Satan and his angels fought. So now you have other fallen angels who might be at this servant level, have defected. When did they defect? We don't know. All we know is if we were to go with the chronology and the sequential chronology of Revelation 12, which we discussed a few sessions ago, that there were other, when it says that Satan swiped a third of the stars, if that's a reference to angels, seems to be, then that means that a whole other group of them defected or I would say right after Jesus' birth, because that's the sequential chronology. We talked about that. So maybe there was another defection there. And then the Revelation 12 incident I believe is future, so it hasn't happened yet. When Michael and Satan square off, I think it happens in the future. I could be wrong, but I think sequentially it has to go that direction. But as we saw, it bounces. It doesn't ever bounce back. It bounces forward, 33 years, birth, 33 years, and then bounce to the end. Okay, so let's see if I answered. Yep. The evil sons of God that mated with women, logically, they had to come from the right-hand side of your chart. Yes. So, wicked, the demons are the offspring, but they only started after the Nephilim, after the body was killed. So, okay, well that is the question and answer session. If you have anything else, please, if you watch this and you have other questions that we haven't covered, email me and we'll do another one of these in the future.